Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, a podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. And today I am joined by Mahrs Schoppman. Mahrs, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
We've been running in some similar circles working in religious trauma. So I'm super stoked to have you on today and get to talk with you about the work that you're doing. I always start with kind of the same question, which is how'd you get into the mental health field?
Yeah, well, I got into the mental health field. And in some ways, I always wanted to be in the mental health field. When I was a child, I wanted to be a child therapist, and when I was a teenager, I wanted to be an adolescent therapist. Um, but then in my late teenage years, I took a big turn and really wanted to dedicate my life to the ministry, go into youth ministry. I thought I didn't want to sit in a room and wait for people to come to me to talk about their problems. I wanted to um, be more out in the field, so to speak. And so I got really invested in youth ministry work. And then that's a long story that maybe we'll get to of me leaving that.
Hmm.
Took a few years to deconstruct and then just came right back to it. I discovered something called somatic psychotherapy that really involves the body, and my body felt lit up by that idea. And the next month, I was in grad school. Um, and I've been a therapist now for about 12 years, and I love it.
Yeah, awesome. I love the roundabout journeys we all kind of take to get
Right? Yeah.
here. Uh, well, and most therapists, I think, have a similar kind of, there's some pull towards helping people, whether it's therapy
Yeah.
specific. I wanted to be a doctor when I was growing up. I wanted to be a
Mm.
monkey trainer originally. And when I found out that wasn't a real job, I learned doctor. But yeah, so
How disappointing.
I know, right? The wonder of being a child that were
Right.
snatched away from us as we become adults. Um, Going out into the field and working with people sounds so evangelical.
And that's exactly what it is. Yep. So
Uh,
evangelical.
yeah. So, which is what I was raised. I was raised evangelical Lutheran, which is all of the guilt and shame of evangelicals without any of the fun speaking in tongues or anything like that.
Did you
Um,
get the rock bands at least?
no, German
No, not
Lutheran's
even.
very
Yeah.
stoic German. We have the old
Mm,
hymnal
yeah.
organs. When people play piano, it was like controversy.
Mhm.
So we need to use the organ.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, do you mind talking a little bit about kind of the evangelical background?
Not at all. Not at all. No, I went to a Baptist school from kindergarten through 12th grade where the piano was also not allowed. The organ was the only only thing allowed where we were taught that Satan was the fallen angel of music, and that was his primary way of getting into people's minds and leading them away from God. And so, drum beats, anything that sounded quote unquote secular was banned.
Sure.
Um, and so, yeah, it was a real conservative place for me to be. That was juxtaposed with my family life, where my folks came to know Jesus through recovery,
Hmm.
AA and NA, and then sent me to this school thinking like Christianity is Christianity and we don't know anything about it, so we need to learn about it through our kids. And so um, I was kind of tasked to be the go-between this incredibly conservative school, and then my parents were by name Christian, but a lot more feral in comparison to the conservative environment. I believe my message machine growing up was my dad saying, "Leave a message or I'll kill you." And so our
Sure.
Christian principal would call and stammer and say she had the wrong number. But yeah, and then in high school, I got really into the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, the rock band kind of church, and
Hmm.
that's where I started to get pulled into ministry and stuff.
Sure.
Um, yeah.
So Satan got you through the music eventually.
Through the music, he always does. I just wanted to shake my hips.
And I love talking to people who work with religious trauma because like it all sounds so similar. If you were raised in a very conservative or fundamentalist background, there's all this overlap, but there's these weird quirks of like, right, like that's such a
Mhm,
quirky thing. I remember arguing with my youth pastor about System of a Down, but that was like very
mhm.
specifically because he thought that band was satanic, not that music was
Right.
satanic. So
Mm,
I
mhm.
love kind of the different geographical places and the different quirks of these churches that are like, this is the
Absolutely.
thing we're gonna
Mhm.
plant our flag in and really dig our heels in. Like music is bad. That's
Yeah. Yeah, well, music liberates, right? And
mhm.
a lot of these dogmatic systems are afraid of anything that liberates.
Yeah. And so music and now working in somatic experiencing, what was kind of the connection there? Was that like feeling something physically and that's like, hey, I need to share this with people? What was kind of that transition point in your life?
Transition point from Christianity to not being a Christian.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
you go from conservative to less conservative, you get to listen to the rock bands, and
Totally.
then what's kind of the transition away from that?
Yeah, well, I went to and quick clarification, I'm not yet certified as a somatic experiencing person. That is, it's like its own very particular thing. I'm
Sure.
have a broader somatic training, but I'm about to start the somatic experiencing training in March. So yeah, to
Yeah.
get nitpicky there. Um, that transition, it was a long transition, but I would say like that there was two major life events um that really let it along, and one of them was just really feeling in my body the way the church was responding to death. There was a very tragic death of a young person in my church, who was the worship leader at the time, um, and the response that we should be celebrating that he's in heaven and to bypass the grief. My body was just screaming like this doesn't feel right. My body needed to grieve, um, and I didn't necessarily trust that because I was taught to not trust my body, and to
Hmm.
not trust emotions. But that was incredibly formative, and I think it was one of the first big splits, for me away from the church. And there were many more, but the last straw was when I realized I was queer,
Hmm.
and I was lined up to take a full-time youth minister position at this like semi mega church, and I drove up and I said, I'm quitting because you're gonna fire me. And
Yeah.
and the way the church handled that, they handled it very quietly. They're like, let's just tell people you're more fit for urban ministries, whatever that means. And just the loss of family and community,
Hmm.
in one day. That was another factor that just threw me into a deep deconstruction phase. But I'm incredibly lucky in that in going to Christian school, I became friends with all of the queers and the artists and the all the outcasts, and so I had a community of people that we were deconstructing together,
Yeah.
and I will forever be so grateful for that.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I have had a lot of neurodivergent folks on the podcast, and we like to
Uh-huh.
joke that like neurodivergent brains find each other. I think queer brains
Yeah,
find each other. Like,
absolutely. Hmm.
and when it is an in-group out-group dynamic, I think people who feel like they are in the out-group tend to be drawn towards each other.
Hmm. Absolutely. I'll never celebrate oppression, like never. And
Hmm.
there is something beautiful that can happen, to the bonds created, between people under the rock of oppression.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that not deconstructing alone is really nice because it can be a
Yeah.
very lonely experience, as you highlighted in your story, like the loss of how much support and church connections in just one day.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's one of the things that the church uses to keep people in it, and that's one
Yep.
of the things that keeps people afraid from leaving, for sure.
Absolutely. Mhm.
So you threw out a word that my brain lights up on, which is bypassing. Uh, Spiritual bypassing. I mean, this concept
Mhm.
of the afterlife, of heaven, like it's
Mhm.
a classic example, I think, of spiritual bypassing, where instead of being in your body, letting your brain be uncomfortable and working through those emotions that come along with that, those emotions and those physical feelings that come along with that, we
Mhm.
skip it
Yep.
by saying a Bible verse. Or
Mhm.
and so the phrase spiritual bypassing is related to slap a Bible verse, let go and let God. God works in
Mhm.
mysterious ways, whatever version of
Mhm.
that you grew up with.
Not of this
Um,
world.
yeah, and that it kind of inhibits our brain from being able to do the work and working through that discomfort that comes with a natural thing like grief or loss.
Right.
Um, so I think that's a common experience that people have in my body's telling me something. This doesn't
Mhm.
feel right. This doesn't fit for
Mhm.
kind of where my brain's at or my body's at or both.
Yeah.
Um, so how'd you take that and run with it, explore it a little bit? Because there is all this work to bypass that. There is all this
Mhm.
work to not trust your body. Your body is bad or sinful.
Mhm.
So what was that kind of like for you as you started to tug on that thread a little bit?
Oh, slow and tedious and painful and liberating. Um, I really I think that a lot of the major religions that subscribe to a fear-based dogma celebrate dissociation as holiness. And I was so deeply trained to ignore my body um, as, um, as an act to be celebrated,
Mm-hmm.
right? Pick up your cross and follow him, right? Just I think push forward to, but I was socialized female in the church as well, and so to put everything and everyone before oneself and to just be of service
Mm-hmm.
were really the messages, and so when I left, I was pretty dissociated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and didn't even know that I was dissociated. And it was a really, really, really long journey to even understanding that to have a sense of oneness with one's body and for that to be a good thing that can feel like a source of dignity and choice was a really abstract idea. And I went into my master's degree to study somatic psychotherapy because my body just like led me there. And
Yeah.
I got there and I was like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like I was just surrounded by people who had been in embodiment practices for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And I was realized my major task was just to learn how to be a body. Um, and I think I've come a long way. And I still know that my major task on this earth is to learn how to be a body
Yeah.
and to learn that with other people.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. And it's a podcast, so people can't see my face, but I'm just smiling
Mhm.
here because like of how often, doing this work, working with religious trauma, we hear stories like this and like that
Mhm.
disconnect between your body. Faith as a concept is like very much like it's in your heart, but like that doesn't make sense. Your heart's a
Yes.
muscle. So like there's all these things that distance us from our body.
Yeah.
Um, and I think tying in with some of the oppression that happens then, like, right,
Mhm.
our bodies are bad, our bodies are sinful. Um, I have ADHD, so like I have some
Mhm.
disconnects with my body to begin
Oh
with
yeah.
some sensory
Mhm.
stuff. And like I think that was elevated in the like I think that was again, as you're kind of talking, like when you distance yourself from your body, that's praised, that's
Mhm.
sought out in the church.
Yep.
And so it's one of those things where it's like this never felt right for me, but the church was telling me it was good. And so it's hard to deconstruct some of that stuff. It's hard to let that stuff go, even if you're not an active
Mhm.
believer anymore. Some of that
Yeah.
stuff is really ingrained and held in our
Mhm.
body.
Yeah. And it just makes me think of like the gaslighting that occurs in church abuse, right? Like you just said, this doesn't feel good in my body, but they're telling me it's good. And
Hmm.
just how confusing that is and how much that warps one's sense of reality.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's pretty tragic.
Yeah. So what was, in your chronology, you've kind of taken us up to grad school. What was the journey like, grad school on, and I guess into kind of getting to where you're at now, working with religious trauma, working with queer
Mhm.
folks who are coming out of maybe religious a traumatic religious background.
Yeah, yeah. When I started seeing clients in grad school and my practicum, just by the, dare I say, the magic of therapy, a bunch of folks came to my practice who had religious trauma.
Hmm.
And I didn't even know that that was a thing at the time, like those words. And over the years, I came across Marlene Winnell's book, Religious Trauma Syndrome, and I was like, oh wow, this is a thing. This is a field of study, a small one, albeit, but
Hmm.
just having words to my experience was really incredible. And I was working with individuals. Um, Probably for about 8 years around religious trauma, um, of all folks, but mostly queer survivors.
Hmm.
And it just occurred to me that because religious trauma is a group trauma, that I thought that there'd be really a lot of power in creating safe enough group spaces,
Hmm.
for people to share their stories and for us to be in embodiment practices together. So about 2 years ago or so, time is a funny thing, but I think about 2 years ago, I started leading groups for queer survivors of religious trauma.
Hmm.
And those have been um, it's really powerful and amazing. And I feel, thank my lucky stars that I get to do that work. Um, I feel so inspired by the individuals that come through these groups, and the opportunity to be in these group spaces,
Hmm.
to hear one another and to feel resonance. And because of all the gaslighting, to be like, oh wait, okay, that was real for you, that must be real for me too then, and to kind of click in some of the pieces that were shredded by dogma.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a normalizing in group work that can happen. It's one of the big things that you lose community when you leave the church, and then building that
Yeah.
community back up and finding people who say, oh, purity cult, you had a purity culture ceremony. Wait till you
Hmm.
hear about mine. Like, and some
Right.
of that
Hmm.
shared language and shared experience is so
Hmm.
soothing, just having
Yeah,
someone else who understands it.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And when I first started these groups, I had it be for folks with evangelical trauma, and then I had people of all different religions contacting me and be like, "Please, can I? Can I've been looking for a group like this my whole life." And it's realized it's just different flavors of the same type of religious abuse and harm. And so the group is now open to anybody who has been harmed by a restrictive religious experience.
Yeah, they're kind of all operating off the same playbook, aren't they?
They sure are. Yeah, fear, control.
Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
so what I have some thoughts on this, but I'm gonna
Hmm.
ask it as a
Yeah.
question first. What are some of the things specific to the queer community that your work focuses on, or that you hear about regularly from your clients? I think, I already said purity culture, so I think that's one that's going to jump out to people. But
Totally.
what are some of the other things that you're kind of seeing? Hey, like connecting to your body, connecting in a group setting, that's really healing for
Hmm.
people.
Yeah. I feel like the queer community, I think all communities are deeply impacted by religious trauma, and the queer community kind of gets this like double whammy around it. Like, while a lot of people in these restrictive religions are taught that they're bad, their bodies can't be trusted, and that they need a savior of some sort. Queer folks are taught that, and that they're disgusting, that they're an abomination.
Hmm.
I was taught that queerness is the only, homosexuality is the only unforgivable sin.
Hmm.
That God is disgusted by, um, queerness, homosexuality, transness, all these beautiful expressions.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of queer folks get disowned by their churches and their families.
Hmm.
So many like orphaned queer people, young and old, and that shame. Like I like to think of the wisdom of shame as like the body's alarm system when we're moving towards something that's going to get us kicked out of our communities, right? And with queerness, many of us do get kicked out of our communities, and that shame like seeps into the bones. And so
Hmm.
even if we know like, wow, queerness is great, queerness is magic, queerness is beautiful, and it needs to be celebrated, um, that shame is so hard to shake off. And I think
Hmm.
being in group settings and sharing that shame with one another, is a way that it has a harder time surviving. Um, uh, so I think that answers your question. I'm curious to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts as well.
Yeah. And I think that you said double whammy and was like, yeah, because leaving the church is a loss, but for so many people who is, especially in high control religion, they're going to lose their family too. They're going to lose
Yeah.
support in other
Hmm.
places because I talk about this a lot. Like I cannot tell you how many sermons I heard about homosexuality.
Yeah.
I'm in Wisconsin. Never
Right.
heard a sermon about alcoholism, but
Right.
contextually,
Right.
the thing that's much more alarming for the people on Sundays is probably DUIs, drinking too much. Like
Totally.
that. That's a topic that would make sense given our geographic
Hmm.
location and things that
Hmm.
affect the population at large. But we're going to
Right.
focus on this 10% of the population or so wherever we're at. Um, and really make them feel bad about themselves. And so
Hmm.
it's so
Yeah.
bizarre how it's extra picked on. Like
Hmm.
it's the church's favorite thing to
Hmm.
be
Yeah.
bigoted about.
Yeah. And I don't think that like alcoholism is threatening to the church
Hmm.
anywhere near the same way that queerness is, right? I think the church is terrified of queerness and that it symbolizes so many things that the church tries to squash down, like liberation and choice and sex for pleasure and the celebration of
Hmm.
the feminine and these things that if they were really allowed in, um, it would just disintegrate the church. And it
Yeah.
is disintegrating the church. Churches are falling apart left and right, because they can't figure out what to do with us,
Yeah.
and families are leaving churches left and right because they're seeing the ways that queer folks are being treated, and it really points holes in theology, and it points to the lack of empathy,
Hmm.
and so I think the church treats queerness as a threat because in a lot of ways it is actually a
Yeah.
threat.
Yeah. And you said pleasure and identity. Some of these things are liberating. And so the church as a unit and for social control, which is what the
Hmm.
church is about, like
Yep.
anything that's giving you pleasure away from what they're teaching is
Mhm.
a threat to their power.
Absolutely. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It is fascinating to watch kind of the church disintegrate in real time, but also then alarming at how extreme the people who are still in the church are getting. It's one of these things where I don't know if you see this in your work and want to comment on it, but working with queer people, there's so much more acceptance culturally, and
Hmm.
then there's so much more threat politically
Right.
from some of these institutions, and so it's a weird space where finding community is maybe easier than it used to be,
Yep.
and the very real threat of losing rights or being pointed out and losing
Hmm.
rights or being treated as a second class citizen is very real and alarming right now too. What do you kind
Hmm.
of, I don't know, do you have a comment on that, I guess?
I mean, I think it's a really good point. There's always backlash when there's social change,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think folks are pretty. I think the world at large is terrified right now. There's a lot to be terrified by right now, and people are kind of clinging to what they need to cling to, in order to get by. And unfortunately, a lot of people on the religious right are clinging to their hatred.
Hmm.
and and trying to take control in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so it's just it's so disorienting, I think, when you're reconstructing. You've deconstructed a belief system. I talk about deconstruction as kind of you don't believe it anymore, but then deconversion is getting some of it out of your body and relearning some of those things,
Ooh, I like that.
which is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
But then these very real triggers that are brought up of like you found an identity that is authentic and genuine and healthy for you, and society is still trying to take it away or control it in some
Mhm,
ways.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think it's disorienting, and coming out of religious trauma, and especially for queer people, like that again, that double whammy of disorienting of I'm trying to be
Mhm,
safe and establish and feel comfortable in this identity, build support, and also someone else is trying to take it away.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So community becomes very important. Community, I think, we talked about this a little bit earlier. You got to deconvert with some people, it sounds like,
Mhm.
or found that
I did.
community quickly.
Mhm.
Um, when people how do you kind of help people connect, like where do you plug people in as they're deconverting or deconstructing, as they're questioning some of these things? What are some of the things you found helpful maybe in your own experience or that your clients have found to build community when they're struggling with that disconnection from the community they were raised in?
So that's a great question, and I think part of why I started these groups is because I kept being at a loss for that. Like there'd be queer survivors would come into my room and we'd be talking about like you need community, and there's so many beautiful online communities. I would point people to various online communities, and that's incredibly helpful. And like where do religious survivors congregate? They don't really, right?
Hmm.
And so the big one of the biggest reasons I started these groups is to give people a place to come together to talk about those things, and then to encourage them to continue their relationships afterwards.
Yeah.
And I've been a part of some of the religious trauma retreats that Marlene Winnell puts on, and those I know are really transformative spaces for people to get to know other folks who understand them. I hope to in the future run some queer retreats myself,
Hmm.
um, but I feel a real lack of that in-person community technology for survivors, and would love to see more of it. And I think
Yeah.
as a awareness of religious trauma is spreading, there's so many brilliant people who are creating programs and who are doing really incredible work around this. And it's really amazing to know that we're not alone in doing
Yeah.
this work.
What do you see, because there are a lot of spaces online, what do you see the difference between virtual or even hybrid type setups versus doing some of this in person?
I think like get what you can get. Um, I don't really have strong opinions on it. I
Hmm.
think some people just really need in person, and some people really thrive on online. With the pandemic and a lot of therapy moving to online platforms, studies are showing that virtual therapy is just as effective, if sometimes
Yep.
not more effective than in person. And so I really, really celebrate the online and hybrid platforms. And I think that there are some people, especially with like embodiment work,
Hmm.
who could really benefit with more in-person spaces.
Yeah, that's kind of my stance on it too. Like I try and reach people where they're at, and
Yeah.
I think in Wisconsin, I'm the only religious trauma certified practitioner. So like, hey, if you're
I
way up
believe
north,
that. Yeah.
I'm your best bet. So
Yeah.
I hold a lot of space for that. But yeah, I think with
Mhm.
some of the somatic work, especially like for me, I'm ADHD. Being on a call is way more distracting than showing up in
Mm,
person.
yeah.
Having a screen there is more distracting for me than being in person. So
Mhm.
yeah, like I agree. I think um, building these spaces is super important, and just getting the message out is important. And starting not that we're done with the pandemic, but as it gets safe
Right.
to congregate and people are more comfortable meeting in person, like I think some of this
Hmm.
stuff hopefully will build up and continue to grow. When you were deconstructing, were you aware of some of these groups, or was that like kind of a curtain that got pulled back as you were leaving the church?
I was not aware of these groups. No, I don't think I
Yeah.
became aware of them until probably like 10 years after I deconstructed.
Yeah.
And in part, just to speak to how grateful I am, I lived in one of those groups, you know, like a lot of
Mhm.
my friends who I deconstructed with, we left college and we were still like kind of Christian adjacent. So we were like, hey, what does the church actually mean? Like, what would it mean to like kind of do like Acts 1 church start thing? And so we moved into a big craftsman house and started a community and like and had a real heart for trying to serve the poor, so to speak, right? And
Mhm.
to share everything and all of that. And we just continued our deconstruction where it didn't have any flavor of Christianity afterwards. But um, I'll just forever be grateful for that experience where I got to really live in a live group of folks deconstructing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that sounds wonderful. I was lucky in that my wife was ready to deconstruct, had been
Oh
waiting, I
yeah.
think, for me. And I see my background's marriage and family therapy, so I see a lot of couples where
Hmm.
the very gross term of unevenly yoked gets brought up often.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but having that support person in my immediate vicinity available, but like right, it's
Yeah.
one of the things the church is good at is information control, and so you don't know there are
Hmm.
these groups of people who are deconverting. I talk about them
Yep.
as cohorts, like people who are kind of deconverting at the same time, and that's really
Hmm.
important. And I do think the
Hmm.
church still really tries to suppress that, so it seems so
Yeah.
scary to step outside because you
Hmm.
don't know if you're going to find acceptance anywhere else. You feel like you won't. But yeah, the number of groups that are out there continues to grow, which is great. And people being certified and specializing in it is
Hmm.
wonderful because, yeah, people are leaving the church in droves, but they don't always know where to land.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm going to shout out Janice Selby, who
Hmm.
organizes the conference on religious trauma. I know you got to speak at the most recent one.
I did.
Um, as a professional, we're going to nerd out as professionals a little bit. What's it like
Hmm.
finding some of these people who are also doing the work? Like, how does that reflect in you itself, a therapist?
I think it's coming back to that thing of not being alone, you know? Like,
Hmm.
I met Janice Selby at a Marlene Manal religious trauma conference that we were helping facilitate. And the work that she's doing is incredible with court and divorcing religion and the various projects that she's doing, but also just so many other therapists, yourself included, of people I've gotten to like meet online. Um, I think when I first started this work, I thought I was one of the only people doing it. And I thought that I was like building the plane as I was flying it.
Hmm.
And then, you know, to come across Marlene Winell's book and Jamie Lee Finch's book and various other books that have been since written on the topic, there's just this deep exhale that happens in my body of like we're not alone. That this is a growing community and it's a really beautiful community.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah, and you know, opportunities like this to, you know, like say try to say yes to these experiences, just, you know, to get to have a conversation with you, to get to know
Yeah,
you more too, and then
yeah,
to have these connections. Yeah.
yeah. It's
Mhm.
I agree. I think finding all this stuff, like after I was comfortable referring to myself as an atheist, is when I started finding all these things. And I feel like,
Yeah.
man, if I would have known while I was deconstructing or while I was
Hmm.
battling some of these things, what maybe that process would have sped up, because it was a long process for me.
Yeah.
Um, lot of health trauma.
That's
So
real.
finally, like letting that stuff go for a lot of people, it takes a while. So yeah, I think that's really wonderful. Erica Smith is a sex educator, is the purity culture
Yep.
dropout program. She spoke at court as well. So
hmm
just again, all these connections, not just with therapists, but with other educators and with other people who are kind of mental health adjacent.
hmm
Um, because I do think something like religious trauma affects people at in all these different ways. Just the belief system is only one of the ways in which it affects people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Really well said. Yeah. Were you a therapist when you deconstructed?
I was, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I started my career working at a Christian counseling center. Um,
Wow. That is quite the shift.
yeah, well, and it was one of those things where it was in there. Like I was
Mhm.
deconstructing without having the
Yeah.
language for it because I was trying to help people understand like wives submit to your husband as not a
Mhm.
patriarchal concept. Like I was trying to deconstruct that stuff in real time because I
Right.
had the research, the psychology
hmm
background to say this is what a healthy relationship looks like.
Right.
Early young therapist quoting Gottman all the time and talking about that stuff. So I
hmm
was, kind of doing some of that real time without having the language for it. And then I worked in higher ed, also at a Christian institution, and like was the safe
Nice.
space on campus. I would specifically work with the
hmm
LGBTQ kids to be like, you're not going to
Nice.
hell. Like, look, someone loves you. Um,
hmm
and not necessarily being super aware of still being in like that doing harm to me by being in an institution that wasn't healthy. So
hmm
you
It's
it sounded like
really
you did this.
huge work you did then at that Christian college. I remember
Yeah.
that guy from my group of friends was Scott Akamoto, who has a podcast called Chapel Probation, and it just makes such a huge difference to have one authority figure be like, actually, you're all right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But you do when you're deconstructing, you try and find ways to stay in it. It sounds like you kind of did that too, of like if the church wasn't so bad, what would it look like? And like
Right.
you try and stay in it. I think there's
Yep.
that desire that want to keep your community or find a way to
hmm
salvage the good stuff.
hmm And there are a lot of good. There is a lot of good stuff. Right.
Hmm. Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah, it's a high price. It's
Right.
not good enough, but it's a high price. But
Yeah.
we so desperately want safety, connection, belonging, dignity,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
there's some sense of those things
Yeah,
sometimes.
and community. I always chuckle when I get the chance to speak at like a UU church, a Unitarian Universalist church, and like it's still triggering, and however many years later, for me to go into an actual church.
Oh
Like there's
yeah.
just
hmm
like I tense, like I can feel it in my body that I tense up,
hmm
and it's like I'm there to talk about religious trauma. Like
hmm
these are people who are
hmm
not, and it's still even though I do the work and I help other people do the work, like you still sometimes have that visceral response to it. And so yeah, there's good stuff, and like building that community and rebuilding community, reconstruction, like all that stuff is lovely. We're wired for connection, and so that's
Absolutely.
what people are looking for. Just
hmm
gotta get the
Yeah.
patriarchy and the oppressive bullshit out of there.
Yes, please. hmm
So, Mars, one of the things I also like to talk about in the podcast is what does self care look like in your life now? You know all this stuff intellectually, you help other people do it, but how do you kind of take care of yourself?
What a wonderful question. I think that my self-care compass is really pointed towards trying to be as present as possible. One of the biggest travesties of religion is how much it tears us away from the present moment and has us focusing on fear of hell, hope for heaven, how to save that person, how to, be manipulative in relationships in order to convert people, how to bypass everything in your body. And so, um, my continued healing journey and my self care practices are all pointed to working on being present with all the emotions that come up for me, and so that includes meditation. And I'm lucky enough to live in a redwood forest, and so I go on long hikes with my dog on the regular, and try to really take my relationship with the natural world very seriously.
Hmm.
So I was taught that I'm not of this world my whole life, to really reclaim that I am an animal of this world, and
Hmm.
that this world is the only thing I really truly know that I have at any given moment. And time with my family. I have an amazing 6-year-old daughter who is very much in her body and in her creativity, and so doing art and playing with her,
Hmm.
being with community and friends. It's taken me, like, quite honestly, a very long time to develop a self-care practice that I feel good about. And
Hmm.
at this point in my life, I feel pretty good about it, and I fall off of it all the time. You know?
Yeah, I relate to that very strongly.
Yeah.
Um, and still struggling against some of that. For me, I think of it as fundamentalist thinking of like there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do
Yeah.
it, and like
Right.
pushing back
Mhm.
against that. Oh, I'm failing at this because I'm not sticking to it, or
Mhm.
whatever. So yeah, I hear that a lot from my clients, the people I'm working with, but also the other therapists in this profession of like, yeah,
Mhm.
creating space for yourself and gentleness, some
Mhm.
compassion. I'm jealous of the redwood forests. I love nature is
Mhm.
such a big part of my self care and reconnection.
Mhm.
We don't
Are
have
you around
redwoods
much
in
nature?
Wisconsin.
Right. Right.
uh,
I do know that.
I'm in a city. I'm in Milwaukee, but we
Uh-huh.
live about 2 blocks from a nature preserve, which is really nice. So
Nice.
it's my
Great.
escape within the city. You don't quite get away from the city sounds all the time, but
Sure.
I have a couple
Hmm.
dogs. I got 2 little kids, so we like to go romp around in the woods.
Nice.
And I have ADHD, I've mentioned, so like fire and water
Hmm.
are really healing for me. And so I
Hmm.
go out on my paddleboard in winter. That's not available, but I spend a lot of time on
Sure.
the water in the summer.
Hmm.
And when it's
Hmm.
cold, it's a good time for a fire. So it kind of works where
Yep.
I can tap into those things that have always been very stimulating for my brain. I just never quite understood why. And so trying to be
Mm.
intentional around those things and build those things.
Seems like you've really done a lot of work to understand your brain and what it is that you need.
Yeah. Well, and I talk about neurodivergence a lot because I do think you probably experience this working with queer folks and being queer yourself. Like
Hmm.
there's so much about religious trauma that affects everybody, and then there are
Hmm.
these quirky ways in which it affects you individually. And so I talk about
Yeah.
the way that religion preyed on my ADHD. Like there are
Wow.
aspects of neurodivergence, being a black and white thinker, that works really
Hmm.
well with fundamentalism. Like my brain liked
Hmm.
some of the rules, not all of them, but
Yeah.
some of them, and the right and the wrong. So there's
Absolutely.
all this untangling that needed to happen, and the
Hmm.
relationship I had with my diagnosis with ADHD has really changed after I deconverted because the way I relate
Hmm.
to my body is so different.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, it's an ongoing process. I don't feel like it's
Mm.
established. I love that you brought up a child because I have a 5-year-old and a almost 3-year-old. His birthday's coming up,
Mm.
and they are like it's so
Congratulations.
fascinating to watch them live and experience the world. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
I'm not
Hmm.
teaching them about hell. They're just like confident. I don't have to teach them what
Yeah.
other people worry about. Doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Like, so
Right.
it's healing and it's fascinating to kind of watch and learn and
Hmm.
see it happen in real time.
I couldn't agree with you more. It really blows me away. It's such a joy to. I mean, every time I tell my daughter you can trust your body, I tear up. It's just
Hmm.
something like so beautiful that I get to tell her that. I get to point her back to the wisdom of her body over and over and over again, and she's not gonna have that same experience that I had,
Yeah.
being taught to dissociate. And she'll have her own struggles and her own path, but it's really just so beautiful to watch this, like, this body be a body.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's always, I have this dual process in my head of like being present with my kids in their experience, and then also kind of playing it back in my head like, oh, wouldn't that be interesting if that would have been my experience as a child.
Right.
um and so yeah, it's wonderful. Kids are a lot sometimes, but they're
Yes.
wonderful. um
Indeed.
yeah.
Mhm.
Mars, this has been wonderful. If people want to learn more about your work, or follow you, where can they find out more information about your practice?
Yeah, I have a website, therapywithmars.com. Mars is spelled Mahrs. And then I also have a Instagram that I said to you before we started, I'm a bit of a Luddite, and so I'm not very good with technology, but my Instagram handle is religious trauma therapist.
Yeah.
Um, um, the subtitle is queer religious trauma somatic therapist. So,
Yeah. And we will
yeah,
link to those things in the show notes to make them easy to
awesome.
find.
Great.
Um,
Thank you, Jeremy.
and I think,
Hmm.
I think Court 2023 slowly gets uploaded on YouTube. I don't know the delay between when it happened but I know your talk there.
Hmm.
Um, you got to talk there, and some of those things get posted slowly as well. Janice Selby is the reason I'm promoting that so much. She's coming on the podcast soon. So
Oh, lucky you.
yeah, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Spoiler to the listeners,
Yeah,
future guest.
yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, so we'll have those links in the website, and definitely if you are able to build to that point of getting some in-person retreats and stuff, we'll highlight that
Mhm.
as well, because I think that stuff's so
Wonderful.
needed and so wonderful when the
Mm.
opportunity arises.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for having me. It was just really lovely to connect with you.
Yeah, for sure. And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in again. This has been Your Therapist Needs Therapy. We will be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.